So less shortages in the supply chain, but increasing shortages in terms of talent. That's the second big problem that the industry is suffering. We're seeing that everywhere. I visited 4 EMS companies last week in the US and Canada, and the same story everywhere. Any light at the end of the tunnel there? Any improvement? Any initiatives that you see working that are successful? Dieter, do you want to take
Well,
that?
I think the biggest challenge is still, as Eric mentioned before, which we learned in all of the companies, is labor. So labor issue is a big issue. People still have problems to find qualified labor. Once in a while, you think pre-COVID it was not that difficult, and now you think, well, where have all these people gone? I can't imagine that they all died of COVID, yeah. So, or that they retired. But all of a sudden, it's the biggest issue. And now, if you look at the production structure of most of the companies, as well as which we visited, we're talking about small or medium volume high mix manufacturing. And see, whereas if I remember one factory last year in France where we saw a high degree of automation with very, very long lines where you saw only one operator handling a machine, that is the exception. It is not what the standard is in the European EMS industry, because the majority of products is still industrial electronics, and here we talk about high mix and low to medium volume, and it becomes more difficult to look at automation. And again, when we talk about automation, we should not look at PCBA manufacturing, because there is already a lot of automation. But if you go into an average EMS factory in Europe, and we see more and more companies doing box building as well, then you can easily say about 30% of the labor on production is in the assembly, and 70% is in the box building. And there is a lot of manual work, and different to what we have seen this year. We've visited this year a lot of companies, like, for example, in Slovenia and Austria, who are heavily involved in the automotive industry, whether it's LED lighting or whether it's power controls or whatsoever. That is a higher quantity, and they have been able to do a lot of automation to assemble those products. But when I remember one company last year in Sweden, very much in the south, Eric, there we saw a huge machine just having been set up where they did the automatic assembly, and they said, well, at the moment we just have one product where it makes sense to do this kind of automation. All the others, the amount of time it requires to set up the machinery is too much. Yeah, so they do have a problem. Still, on the other hand, I'm watching it very carefully, what is being done on the cobot side. And in my opinion, not only are cobots becoming less expensive, there are a lot of very easy ways to automate certain production steps with cobot, and people need to implement that to reduce the required labor.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think adaptable automation shows a lot of opportunity. I spoke to a guy, production manager at an EMS last week. He came from another industry into the EMS industry 5 years ago, and within his company, they have had 5 years where they doubled their revenue and reduced their headcount. And his first edict within the company was stop buying chairs. No chairs on the production line. But also having networked inspection systems and so forth, so less people could operate the SMT lines than previously.
But let's also put this in context of the discussion we just finished about limited capital, right? So the ability to do this is impacted, right? So many would like to invest in more, they can't right now, right? They're just bound. And then the piece that just the complexity of what they're doing with the number of changeovers every day, right? And especially for the post reflow type, those volumes just may not be cost justified. So the other answer to your question is, where are they going? You know, they're going anywhere and everywhere to get it. And so we hear interesting stories. Two that I would mention are some people who are importing labor from outside of Europe right? That's happening. And then the touching one to me was we were at a couple of facilities that had women from the Ukraine who had to flee the war, who are working there. They're very good workers and all, but the concern is at the conclusion of the war, these people are most probably heading back to Ukraine, so they don't see it as a long-term stable solution for them. So people are looking everywhere, and at the same time, that's also a matter about elevating and educating, kids, younger people about the opportunities that exist in this field. And as many of them said, you can't pay people to do that pin through, do this all day, right? That just nobody's going to do that. So I like the idea, and we've seen some facilities where they're so automated, you can bring in younger workers and say, look at all this automation, look at all that we're doing here, right? As opposed to seeing them as just a manual laborer, they're responsible for some pretty cool equipment, doing some very, very high-end technologies. So, I always love talking about the products that are being developed and what's being developed there. And when you see that, it really brings it to life. And I think that's kind of one of the selling points for these companies as well. So,
yeah, you've got to upskill. You've got to upskill the labor because it makes it more attractive for those entering the market. You've got to focus on automation that's adaptable, and maybe to your point about investment, you've got to look at that automation as a service solution, which we're seeing offerings in various different parts of the world. I think that's a key part of it. Before we wrap up, we've got 5 more minutes. Dieter, perhaps just give me a quick overview on where you see the M&A market, the consolidation of EMS, just over the next 12 to 18 months.
Well, at the moment, we already have 35 M&A activities this year, and we are just in the middle of August. So I easily expect this year to end up with more than 50, which equals about 2.5% of all companies working in this field. It has increased over the last 2 years. We have only started watching this in 2021. It's in the majority the smaller companies who are leaving. Actually, we had 2 companies this year, one in Berlin, who closed at the end of last year and sold all the assets to another EMS company and transferred as well the customer base. On the 30th of June, we had another small company, both companies less than 5 million in revenues, which just said it makes no sense to me anymore. I can't see that I'm going to find a buyer for my business, so I'm shutting it down and selling the machinery. So this is just 2 examples. I have another example in the UK, which was even very, very small. It was more or less a 2 or 3 people business. Yeah, they are finally tired and they give up because it's getting more difficult in the business. So that is one situation we see. On the other hand, there are definitely things which are positive in our industry. I mentioned before that capital is not cheap anymore. This not only goes for the EMS industry, but it goes for OEMs as well. And if they are having this problem of having to increase their manufacturing capacity, it is much more likely now for them to decide, rather than investing themselves in additional capacity, to say, well, why don't we transfer this business to a service company, to an EMS? And you remember we always say that about 41% of all European electronic products are being manufactured today by EMS companies. And we think that over the next 10 years, this will pick up. And in 10 years from now, we'll be talking about 46%. We see as well, whereas the average growth rate for the EMS industry from 2013 to 2021 was at an annual average of 4.9%. This is going up to 6.9%, fluctuating some years 7.5, but others less. There are various factors affecting this. We are doing a lot of very careful calculations on this. You know, in the past we had been very careful with doing projections of the future, but we have so much experience by now. We know this industry so much due to our first-hand and primary research we do, that we are now capable of projecting over the next 10 years, and that is very good.
Yeah, that's very valuable.
Yeah. On the other hand, we do see an issue, and you can read it all over the places. The CHIPS Act, the US has done a CHIPS Act, Europe has done a CHIPS Act, but that is not good enough. As the PCBAA Association in America says, chips don't float. We, together with IPC, are heavily talking with Brussels at the moment to talk about supporting the full vertical line of production. As I mentioned before, it makes no sense if we build up 20% of global production being in Europe, but we only have 1.9% of the global production of printed circuit boards in Europe. There is only 172 companies left in Europe manufacturing PCBs, and that is a very high risk because we have very sensitive market segments. Talking, for example, about airspace and defense. Yes, 75% of PCBs manufactured for that sector are going to European PCB manufacturers, but we have other very sensitive sectors where we don't have the capacity at the moment, or where we don't get the orders because everybody is just shifting it all to China, and we cannot allow ourselves such a high degree of dependence.
Hey, Dieter, but I did see this, the Tektronika out of Lithuania made their announcement that they've opened up their PCB fab. We heard about that several years ago, and we met with them in Estonia, and he said that they were planning this. Well, that's now has been opened, so that's a step in the right direction.
It is the planning. The planning has been approved. It's not built as of now. Yeah, it still needs.
But I think the point you make is really good, and that's that an integrated supply chain is the only way this regionalization activity works. It's true of parts that go on the PCB. It's true of the PCB itself. It's true of everything that goes into manufacturing finished goods in the region that they're going to be consumed.
Right, and I think that Europe could not build an electronic product based on sourcing just within Europe at this point. So that is seen as risky. That's seen as undesirable in this new reality we live in now. So I think there's actions towards trying to fix that, and I think that would also help the whole reshoring thing, right? You know, if you're going to reshore, you got to have these things available. So
yeah, absolutely, it's fundamental. Gentlemen, thanks so much for your time. I always appreciate your insights. What I appreciate most is your insights are supported by solid, well-researched data, and that makes them much more valuable. I very much look forward to your next tour. I'm in Guadalajara in Mexico. I'm going to go visit some EMS companies and find out a little bit more about what's going on here before I head back up to California. But thank you so much for your time, and look forward to the next EMS Informer on tour. Thank you.
thanks, Phil.
Thank you.